Operation Hailstone transformed Truk Lagoon into the Pacific's largest underwater graveyard in February 1944. American forces unleashed a two-day aerial assault that sent more than 60 Japanese vessels to the ocean floor, entombing thousands of sailors in their steel coffins. Today, divers explore these haunting wrecks where human remains still rest inside cockpits and engine rooms, skeletal hands frozen on controls. The lagoon's warm waters preserved gas masks melded to skulls, mess kits scattered among rib cages, and torpedo tubes that became iron sarcophagi. Coral now encrusts human bones visible through portholes, creating grotesque sculptures of calcium and death. The USS Fujikawa Maru's hold contains bodies still wearing their uniforms, while the Shinkoku Maru's engine room preserves crew members who drowned when compartments flooded. This submerged necropolis attracts macabre tourism, where recreational divers photograph the skeletal residents of a maritime mass grave that will remain undisturbed for centuries. Appalachian death omens adapted Irish banshee mythology, with witnesses describing an inhuman shriek echoing through mountain hollows hours before a death occurs. The sound reportedly causes physical reactions, nausea, hair standing on end, and overwhelming dread that persists for days. Unlike the Irish banshee attached to specific families, the Appalachian version appears randomly, targeting any household. Accounts describe a woman's scream mixed with animal howling, pitched at frequencies that cause psychological distress. Some witnesses claim the sound moves impossibly fast, heard simultaneously in multiple locations miles apart. Children reportedly hear it more frequently, waking families with descriptions of the cry hours before a family member's fatal accident or sudden death. The phenomenon correlates with isolated communities where death often occurred without warning, mining accidents, sudden illness, or violence. Psychological explanations suggest mass hysteria or coincidental animal sounds, but the consistency of descriptions across generations and isolated communities is notable. Some accounts include visual elements, a pale figure in white glimpse before the sound, or shadows moving against moonlight. The phenomenon persisted into the 20th century, with documented accounts as recent as the 1960s describing the whale preceding unexpected deaths. The Donner Party's 87 pioneers became snowbound in November 1846, with 41 dying before rescue in April 1847. Starvation drove survivors to consuming the dead, beginning with those who had died from exposure, their frozen bodies preserved by snow. Survivors initially boiled leather boots and animal hides, then progressed to human flesh as desperation intensified. Rescuers documented partially consumed bodies with flesh systematically removed from limbs, organs extracted, and bones cracked for marrow. Some victims showed evidence of being butchered immediately after death, suggesting monitoring of the dying. Children's remains displayed more extensive processing as their bodies provided less meat and were consumed more completely. Survivor accounts described roasting human flesh over fires and the unbearable psychological burden of consuming friends and family members. Brain tissue was particularly valued for its fat content, with skulls cracked open and emptied. The Forlorn Hope group included 7 survivors who admitted to consuming the dead after drawing lots to determine who would be killed, a plan abandoned when natural deaths provided flesh. Forensic analysis of bones found at the site confirmed cut marks consistent with defleshing and pot polishing from boiling. Stanley Kubrick subjected Shelley Duvall to 127 takes of the baseball bat scene in The Shining, the most retakes for a scene with dialogue in film history, deliberately exhausting her to achieve authentic terror. Duvall's hair began falling out from stress during filming, visible in later scenes. Kubrick isolated her from the cast socially and criticized her performance publicly to maintain her psychological fragility. She cried so frequently that the script supervisor kept tissues constantly available, and filming the scene lasted over a week of 12-hour days. The physical demands caused dehydration so severe that medical personnel monitored her condition, and her hands became raw from gripping the bat. Kubrick forbade other cast members from comforting her, ensuring she remained in an anxious state between takes. Duvall later described the experience as traumatic, stating it was the most difficult year of her life. The famous all work and no play scene required her to maintain terror while discovering hundreds of typed pages, filmed repeatedly until her screaming reached the desired pitch. She hyperventilated so often that she risked fainting. Kubrick's technique, while producing iconic performances, left Duvall emotionally scarred, contributing to her later mental health struggles documented in interviews decades later. The 1889 Rinderpest pandemic killed 90% of African cattle, causing approximately 2 million human deaths through starvation and societal collapse. The virus caused hemorrhagic fever in cattle, with animals bleeding from every orifice before dying within days. Infected herds liquefied from the inside, their intestinal lining sloughing off and expelled as bloody diarrhea that contaminated pastures. Pastoralist societies watched their entire wealth die simultaneously, leaving corpses rotting in fields that poisoned water supplies. The Maasai population declined by 60% as famine triggered vulnerability to smallpox and other diseases. Desperate populations consumed infected meat despite warnings, contracting secondary infections. Colonial records describe landscapes littered with cattle skeletons, the bones bleaching in the sun for decades. The pandemic enabled colonial conquest as weakened societies couldn't resist European encroachment, fundamentally altering African history. Veterinary records documented entire herds dying overnight, with mortality rates approaching 100% in naive populations. The virus spread through respiratory droplets and contaminated fodder, moving faster than preventive measures. Human starvation cases showed classic kwashiorkor and marasmus, with abdominal distension and muscle wasting. Survivors face permanent nutritional damage, with children showing stunted growth. The Indus Valley Civilization script appears on approximately 4,000 seals and tablets, averaging 5 symbols per inscription, too brief for conventional linguistic analysis. The civilization collapsed around 1900 BCE without passing on their writing system, creating a permanent linguistic black hole. Each seal potentially represents ownership, religious incantations, or administrative records, but without a Rosetta Stone equivalent, their meaning remains impenetrable. The symbols include approximately 400 distinct characters, suggesting a logo-syllabic writing system, but no clear pattern emerges. Some seals were found in Mesopotamian archaeological sites, indicating trade relationships, yet no bilingual texts exist. The civilization's urban planning, drainage systems, and standardized weights demonstrate sophisticated administration, making their writing system's loss particularly frustrating. Attempts at computational decipherment have failed as the corpus is too small and lacks contextual variety. The seals often accompany human remains in burial contexts, suggesting religious or identity purposes, but their specific function remains speculative. The civilization's abandonment left cities intact but empty, with no evidence of conquest or catastrophe, deepening the mystery of why their knowledge wasn't transmitted. Danny Rolling murdered 5 University of Florida students over 4 days in August 1990, employing a signature pattern of evening attacks where he incapacitated victims before torturing them. He targeted first-floor apartments, prying open sliding glass doors, and waiting inside for occupants to return. His first victims, Christina Powell and Sonia Larson, were posed post-mortem in sexually explicit positions intended to maximize shock for discoverers. Autopsies revealed extensive defensive wounds, indicating prolonged struggles before death from exsanguination caused by systematic stabbing. Rolling cleaned crime scenes partially, removing some evidence but deliberately leaving bodies displayed as psychological warfare against investigators and the community. His third victim, Krista Hoyt, was decapitated and her head placed on a shelf facing the door, her torso posed. He taped one victim's mouth shut and terrorized her for extended periods before killing her. Forensic analysis showed he used the same K-bar knife for all murders, causing wounds with distinctive serration patterns. The killings paralyzed Gainesville, with students fleeing en masse and those remaining purchasing weapons. Rolling was captured months later through DNA evidence and executed in 2006. Chris Farley's final hours on December 18, 1997, involved consuming cocaine and morphine with a hired companion who left him alive but struggling, returning later to find his 296-pound body cold and blue. The autopsy revealed advanced atherosclerosis in A 33-year-old, with coronary arteries 75% occluded from years of substance abuse combined with obesity. His heart weighed 540 grams, significantly enlarged from chronic hypertension and drug-induced cardiomyopathy. The official cause was overdose combined with atherosclerotic heart disease, the speedball, cocaine and morphine combination, causing cardiac arrhythmia that stopped his heart. His brother found him face down in his Chicago apartment, arms splayed, having been dead approximately 6 hours, early rigor mortis setting in. Toxicology showed lethal levels of morphine combined with cocaine metabolites, indicating he'd been using for hours before death. The autopsy noted liver enlargement and fatty infiltration consistent with alcohol abuse, and his lungs showed chronic inflammation from smoking. His final years involved multiple interventions and rehab stays, but weight fluctuations of over 100 pounds yearly stressed his cardiovascular system catastrophically. Friends described finding him unconscious on previous occasions, preventing death temporarily before the final fatal episode. The 1918 Espionage and Sedition Acts imprisoned approximately 2,000 Americans for opposing World War I, many serving sentences in brutal federal penitentiaries where disease and violence were rampant. Socialist leader Eugene Debs received 10 years for an anti-war speech, serving time until President Harding commuted his sentence in 1921, his health permanently destroyed by prison conditions. Inmates faced routine beatings from guards, solitary confinement in unventilated cells, and forced labor despite illness. Several died in custody from untreated tuberculosis, their families denied bodies for weeks. The act criminalized any speech deemed disloyal to the government, with convictions based solely on witness testimony without physical evidence. German Americans particularly suffered, accused of espionage for speaking their native language, with some beaten by vigilante mobs while police watch. One Iowa farmer received 20 years for stating the war was economically motivated. Women suffragists and labor organizers filled prison cells, subjected to force feeding through nasal tubes when they hunger struck, causing permanent esophageal damage. Prison medical records documented psychological breakdowns, attempted self-harm, and deaths attributed to natural causes that were clearly consequences of abuse. The candiru, a parasitic Amazonian catfish reaching 6 inches, possesses backward-facing spines that anchor it inside host organisms. While rare, documented cases describe the fish entering urethras attracted by urine's ammonia, then lodging itself immovably inside the urethra, using its spines, causing agonizing pain and urinary obstruction. Removal requires surgical intervention, as the spines embed so deeply that pulling causes extensive tissue tearing and hemorrhaging. One documented 1997 case involved a fish extracted from a patient's urethra after causing such severe swelling that urination became impossible and the bladder dangerously distended. The surgical removal required penile amputation in historical cases when extraction proved impossible. Indigenous populations developed specific techniques for emergency removal, including penile compression to force the fish out, or insertion of 2 specific plant species whose juice dissolves the candiru's body, killing it internally so it can be expelled. The fish primarily parasitizes gills of larger fish, using its teeth to rasp blood vessels and feed on blood, occasionally stripping so much tissue that host fish bleed to death. Its translucent body makes detection difficult in murky water, and it can survive inside a host for extended periods, continuously feeding on surrounding tissue. Mongolian tribes practiced mortuary bone boiling, where deceased family members' bones were cleaned, crushed, and steeped in boiling water to create a ceremonial broth consumed by surviving relatives. The ritual required meticulous flesh removal through days of decomposition monitoring, then boiling the skeleton for hours until bones became porous and brittle enough to release their marrow and mineral content. Family members drank this viscous liquid, believing it transferred the deceased's strength and wisdom, ingesting calcium particulates and dissolved collagen that created a distinctly gelatinous texture. The practice held particular importance for warrior ancestors, whose skulls received special preparation, boiled separately, then converted into ceremonial drinking vessels lined with silver. Ethnographic accounts describe children forced to consume portions regardless of nausea, as refusal dishonored the dead. The preparation process filled encampments with the distinctive smell of rendering human remains, a sweet rotten odor that clung to clothing and tents. Buddhist missionaries documented their horror at witnessing these rites, noting the casual handling of human skeletal remains as cooking implements. The practice gradually disappeared but persisted in remote regions until the 19th century, with some vessels preserved in museums still showing residue analysis confirming human bone protein. The Clovis people vanished around 10,900 BCE, leaving behind campsites with butchered mammoth remains and distinctive fluted spear points still embedded in fossilized bone. Archaeological evidence suggests their megafauna prey base collapsed catastrophically, possibly from the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, a cosmic airburst that triggered immediate climate cooling. Excavations reveal sudden abandonment of settlements with tools and partially processed kills left in place, suggesting rapid depopulation. Some sites contain human remains showing signs of nutritional stress, with bones displaying Harris lines and enamel hypoplasia indicating repeated starvation episodes. The extinction of their prey, mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, likely caused cascading societal collapse as specialized hunting techniques became obsolete overnight. Evidence of increased interpersonal violence appears in later Clovis remains, with projectile points embedded in human bones, suggesting desperation as resources dwindled. Children's skeletons show particularly severe malnutrition markers, with growth stunting and bone porosity indicating they suffered most. DNA analysis reveals genetic bottlenecks in descendant populations, confirming massive population reduction. Some remains display unusual cut marks, potentially indicating cannibalism during the final crisis period before cultural dissolution. Scottish folklore's Kelpie manifests as a majestic horse near water, its coat irresistibly soft and inviting. Those who mount it find their hands fusing to its hide through supernatural adhesion, the flesh bonding at a molecular level so forcefully that attempts to dismount tearskin from palms. The Kelpie then plunges into the loch, dragging victims to depths where water pressure compresses their lungs and ruptures their eardrums. Legends describe bodies resurfacing days later, bloated and nibbled by fish, hands still impossibly attached to hair woven from water plants. Some tales recount partially consumed corpses washing ashore, organs removed with surgical precision, suggesting the Kelpie feeds on internal tissues. The creature supposedly targets children specifically, drawn by their innocence and smaller body mass that allows easier dragging. Variations describe victims conscious during drowning, unable to fight as cold water fills their lungs, and darkness closes in. The Kelpie's eyes reportedly glow with bioluminescent green light, the last thing victims see. Some stories claim it shapeshifts into human form to lure victims, revealing its true nature only when touching water, by which point escape proves impossible. The November 1st, 1755 earthquake struck during All Saints' Day Mass, collapsing churches filled with worshippers and trapping them under burning rubble as altar candles ignited the wreckage. Survivors who fled to the waterfront for safety were obliterated by 3 successive tsunami waves up to 20 meters high, their bodies swept out to sea or crushed against collapsed buildings. The earthquake opened fissures that swallowed people whole, then closed, entombing them alive in crushed darkness. Firestorms raged for 5 days, incinerating those trapped under debris who could be heard screaming as the flames approached. Bodies accumulated so rapidly that authorities dumped them in mass graves or weighted them with stones and pushed them into the Tagus River, where they bloated and resurfaced, bobbing in the harbor for weeks. Approximately 50,000 people died, many unidentifiable due to burning or crushing injuries. Survivors described the liquefaction of ground where solid earth became quicksand that swallowed buildings and people, leaving only ripples. The disaster triggered stillbirths and miscarriages among pregnant survivors from trauma. Hospitals overflowed with crushed limbs requiring amputation performed without anesthesia while patients were held down. Following Jaws' release, shark populations plummeted by up to 90% in some regions as revenge killings and trophy hunting exploded. Fishermen specifically targeted great whites, hanging their carcasses on docks for photographs while their still living bodies thrashed, slowly suffocating as they couldn't force water through their gills out of water. Shark fishing tournaments became blood sports where participants mutilated catches, removing jaws and fins while throwing dying sharks back into the ocean. The practice of shark finning intensified where fishermen sliced off fins and dumped mutilated sharks overboard, leaving them to sink helplessly and bleed out or be eaten alive by other predators. Marine biologists documented beaches littered with shark corpses in various states of decomposition, sometimes dozens in a single day. The film's mechanical shark malfunctions during filming ironically prevented more realistic gore, yet the public's fear translated into real carnage. Pregnant females were particularly targeted, their abdomens sliced open on boat decks to remove pups, effectively killing multiple generations simultaneously. Some species faced local extinction, their low reproduction rates unable to compensate for the massacre. The Kokoda campaign killed more Australian soldiers through disease than enemy action, with malaria, dysentery, and scrub typhus causing organ failure in the humid rot. Men's feet decomposed inside their boots from trench foot, skin sloughing off in sheets to expose infected muscle and bone. Tropical ulcers ate through flesh down to the bone, wounds crawling with maggots that provided debridement but could burrow deeper if not removed. Soldiers with dysentery lost control of their bowels completely, dehydrating from fluid loss of up to 20 liters daily until their blood pressure collapsed. Malaria victims seized with temperatures reaching 107 degrees Fahrenheit, cooking their brain tissue and causing permanent neurological damage in survivors. The wounded often died during the 4-day stretcher evacuation through impossible terrain, their bodies buried in shallow graves immediately as decomposition accelerated in tropical heat. Japanese soldiers practiced cannibalism on their own dead when starvation became severe. Medical records documenting discovery of butchered remains. Rain liquefied the mud trails into slurries contaminated with human waste and corpse which soldiers drank from desperation, perpetuating the disease cycle. Beriberi's thiamine deficiency caused victims' peripheral nerves to degenerate, leaving them unable to feel their extremities rotting. The wet form produced congestive heart failure where fluid accumulated so rapidly that patients drowned in their own lymphatic seepage, their lungs filling with transudate. The dry form triggered progressive paralysis, with victims conscious and aware as their muscles atrophied and their feet began to necrotize. In severe cases, Wernicke-Korsakoff syndrome destroyed brain tissue, causing permanent dementia where patients couldn't form new memories, trapped in a continuous present moment of confusion. Asian prisoners fed exclusively polished white rice experienced epidemic mortality rates, with entire barracks dying within months. Autopsies revealed hearts enlarged to double their normal size, their muscle fibers fragmenting and replaced by scar tissue. Nerve biopsies showed myelin sheaths completely stripped away, leaving bare axons that could no longer transmit signals. Dutch physician Christian Eichmann's experiments with chickens proved the connection by inducing paralysis through polished rice diets, watching the birds convulse before dying of cardiac arrest. London's scorching summer of 1858 transformed the Thames into an open sewer of human waste, industrial effluent, and decomposing animal carcasses. The river's oxygen levels plummeted, creating anaerobic bacterial blooms that produced hydrogen sulfide and ammonia, gases strong enough to burn the throat and eyes of nearby residents. Parliament's curtains were soaked in chloride of lime to mask the stench, but members still fled sessions, vomiting from the overwhelming odor. The cholera bacterium thrived in the contaminated water supply, causing the fourth major epidemic that century. Approximately 2,000 Londoners died during the crisis, their intestinal linings literally sloughing off from bacterial toxins. Bodies, awaiting burial, decomposed rapidly in the heat, adding to the miasma. The crisis exposed raw sewage pipes that discharged directly into the Thames at 278 outfall points, creating visible filth plumes. Pathologists examining cholera victims described liquefied organs and dehydration so severe that blood had thickened to a sludge, with patients dying in hours covered in their own evacuated fluids. The Somerton man's body, discovered on December 1, 1948, on an Australian beach, exhibited signs of poisoning, yet no toxins appeared in testing. His final meal remained partially digested in his stomach, a paste he consumed approximately 3 to 4 hours before death. Every identifying label had been meticulously excised from his clothing with surgical precision, and his teeth showed unusual wear, suggesting he might have habitually held something metallic. The cryptic Tamam Shud, paper, meaning ended or finished in Persian, had been torn from a rare copy of the Rubaiyat, found months later in a parked car, containing a coded message that has resisted 7 decades of cryptographic analysis. His calf muscles displayed extraordinary development, suggesting a ballet dancer or specialized athlete. The autopsy noted his spleen was enlarged to 3 times normal size, and his stomach lining showed acute hemorrhaging consistent with certain poisons that metabolize too quickly for detection. Dental examinations and fingerprint analysis yielded no matches. His body was embalmed but later exhumed in 2021 for DNA analysis. Yolanda Saldivar shot Selena Quintanilla once through the back on March 31, 1995, severing her subclavian artery at a Days Inn motel. The 23-year-old singer ran 392 feet to the lobby, leaving a blood trail that soaked through the carpet before collapsing and naming her killer. Medical personnel found her exsanguinated, having lost approximately 400 milliliters per minute during her desperate escape. The autopsy revealed the bullet's trajectory destroyed critical vascular structures, making survival impossible despite emergency surgery. Saldivar had embezzled from Selena's boutiques and fan club before luring her to the motel under the pretense of showing financial records. After firing the fatal shot, she held police at bay for nearly 10 hours in her pickup truck, holding the gun to her own temple while negotiating. Selena's death caused such profound community grief. The crisis counselors reported an epidemic of anxiety attacks among mourners, with some requiring hospitalization. Her embalmed body lay in state for public viewing, where over 50,000 people filed past her glass-topped casket.